Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Welcome everyone to YouTube channel. You need to keep remembering to look at the camera, sorry. Welcome to the Sufi Ibrahim Krebs YouTube channel. We're still getting used to this production system. And today I decided to wear my dark clothes because we're in dark times, as people have probably noticed. So I'm taking a leap into the unknown here. Most of these talks are about pure Sufism, but I decided that this week it was important to make some comments on what's going on in the Middle East, but from a Sufi, from a spiritual perspective, rather than a political perspective. They say that fools will go where angels fear to tread, because this is delicate territory, but as you will see in the talk, the angels have already tread here, so I'm in good company. You'll see what I mean shortly. So when we look at this situation that's going on in the Middle East, the horror that's going on there are a number of levels that we can look at it from. Okay? The first one is what everyone sees on the news every day, and then if they backtrack from the news, they can study it in their history books or in documentaries, the whole long history, torrid history of the Middle East. Don't get it wrong here. This is tribal warfare. They'll never say this because we're living in a democratic era. You're not allowed to talk about tribes. But these are two tribes that have been fighting for a long, long time. Remember the biblical story of David and Goliath. Goliath was a Philistine in the Bible. Philistine in Arabic means Palestinians. So the children of Israel have been fighting against the Palestinians for at least 3,000 years. If you add in the Moses story, whereas people went into the promised land in Canaan, you can add another 300-400 years to that story of the people of Israel fighting against the Canaanites, who were the ancestors of the Palestinians. Okay, so this is not a new story. And don't let anyone frame it in a democratic way as a bunch of white people came from Europe and colonized the Middle East. This battle has been going on a long time before Theodor Herzl and the Zionists and all of them, for at least 3,000, maybe 4,000 years. Okay. If we were cognizant of that and we understood the deep-seated reality, maybe we'd be in a position to make some kind of settlement. But as long as we're talking about human rights and civil rights and nations affirming each other, I think we're going to get lost in this democratic quagmire, which is what's been going on basically for 100 years in the Middle East. Okay, but all that aside, we're not getting into the politics here. It's a long story, and we may cover it in our interactive seminars, but this is not my assignment tonight. Neither the politics, which you're seeing, as I say, on the news every day, nor there are a few other levels before we get to our primary concern here, which is the spiritual level. Okay, there's also, if you want, the intellectual level, which you don't hear much about on the news, but you may see in certain religious programs. The intellectual level is how these two tribes have been interpreting and misinterpreting their own scriptures. And that is also contributing to the current conflict. The misunderstanding of scriptures, both in the Judaic tradition and in the Islamic tradition. But that too is a subject for another time and space. We look into this when we study the Quran to see what is the proper interpretation of many of the Quranic ayats that are being used politically now by various groups to support their extremism. But the Quran is not a book of extremism, it's a book of haq, of truth, as is the Bible, or the Torah, if you want. But we're not covering that either. Sorry to disappoint you. Maybe at some time we'll cover that. But the interpreters of scriptures have gotten a number of things wrong, and some of them are actually contributing to the present conflict. But that, again, is not the subject of our talk tonight. Nor is the subject the psychology of the peoples. That's another prohibited subject. We're not allowed to talk about Jews are like this, and Arabs are like that, and Persians are like... They are like that. But it's not politically correct. If we start talking like that, they say you're a racist, you're racial profiling, so people don't want to hear about it. But it's very important, actually, to understand. This, again, is not part of our program for tonight. Sorry, it may be for another night. Today, what we're going to try to look at is how a spiritual perspective, how we see what's going on from a spiritual perspective. And this might seem to you way out there. It's very different from what's going on a worldly level. Okay, for one thing, you have to factor in the akhirah. The akhirah means the other side. What happens on the other side. So we know that all the religions have a tradition of martyrdom, and the martyrs are great saints in all of Christian, Jewish, Islamic tradition. So they get killed here, but they get paradise on the other side. That has to be factored in. We are not materialists, as Sufis anyway. We're not empiricists. We have to factor in fact, the other side is more important than this side. Okay, so that's the spiritual perspective. But we're going to start with the Quran. Not because it's Islamic, but because it tells us something that, in fact, the Bible, Genesis, doesn't tell us about the creation. And I found this very interesting when I first got involved in Islam. So I'm going to read you a translation of Ayat 30 in Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the second surah. You'll see the relevance shortly. Behold, thy Lord said to the angels, I will create a vice-regent on earth, Khalifa. Okay, that he means man. They said, wilt thou place therein one who will make mischief and shed blood? Noticed anything recently? Mischief and shedding blood. The angels knew. The angels were clairvoyant, and they saw what was coming. They saw all of this a long, long time ago coming. Will you place therein someone who will make mischief and shed blood while we do celebrate thy praise? The angels are only goodness. Only obedience, no mischief, no shedding of blood. And we glorify thy holy name. He said, Allah said, I know what ye know not. Okay, interesting. What does he know that they know not? But the angels are not like people. They say, why, 1 minute here? How can there be a world with mischief and bloodshed and a compassionate God? It doesn't make sense, like the atheists. This is their major argument against believers. How could there be a compassionate God if all of this suffering and mischief and bad behavior is going on? How does God allow it? What does Allah say? I know what you know not. What I understand here, and it's not that clear for the Islamic scholars, I don't think. What I understand from this is, behind all of this mischief, behind all of this bloodshed, there's a positive plan in process. There's a purpose to all of this. None of this happens arbitrarily, and none of this happens just because human beings are bad, which they are in many cases. There's a positive project which is going on at the same time. That's something only faith can lead you to understand. Your mind won't won't be able to comprehend that. I know, Allah says, I know what you know not. I know the positive aspect of this whole process. As said the great Sheikh Hashimi, fi kulli shay khairan. In everything is goodness. Even in this terrible stuff going on in the Middle East, there is goodness in it. But only the believers can comprehend that. The materialists, the people of the outward, they can't see anything besides the suffering and the bloodshed. But we're called upon, as Muslims, as believers, as Christians, as Jews, to accept that Allah knows what He's doing. There's a plan from Allah, and this plan is working itself out. This destiny is working itself out. But make no mistake about it. Man's bad behavior, his bloodthirstiness, his evil, it's part of our DNA. We can't get around. That's why the pacifists get it wrong every time. We cannot avoid war. If we could avoid war, Muhammad ﷺ would have avoided it. Moses would have avoided it. Jesus would have avoided the fitna that came in his time. They all preferred peace, but we can't avoid war. It's part of the DNA of this life. Okay, so that's number one. It's part of creation, this bloodshed. Now, so that's a Quranic ayat. We also have some great Sufis who have dealt with this situation, and we're going to go through a few of them. The first is one of my teachers, Sheikh Nazim. Okay, Sheikh Nazim, amazing man. He used to get into arguments. He didn't argue very often. He wasn't an argumentative kind of guy. But he would get into arguments with the Ikhwan Muslimin. The Ikhwan Muslimin are the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm trying to get the translation. Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt originally. And they've had a large impact. And Hamas actually claims to be a follower of the Ikhwan Muslimin. Okay, and they believe that they can improve the world by establishing a political state of Islam. That's their mission, to have an Islamic caliphate, a bit like the more extremist ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but they're less extremist, more intellectual people. But they believe the solution for all of man's problems is to establish an Islamic state and Sharia. Well, they had their chance in Egypt with Morsi not too long ago, and they failed miserably. And if they're behind what's going on in Hamas, they failed once again. But Sheikh Nazim he wasn't shy to confront people who disagreed with him, and he said, "You don't understand our religion. We have the political leadership that we deserve. If you want to have better political leaders, the people themselves have to improve. That's the only way you'll get good political leadership. It has to come, as they say in America, from the bottom up. When the people improve, the leaders will be better." And we have some recent historical evidence that this is totally correct. You know, when the Americans were getting ready to invade Iraq, Iran may be in the future and stuff. But when they invaded Iraq, I was actually hopeful. I was thinking, Saddam Hussein is a terrible leader. He's brutal, he's tyrannical, he's sadistic. They get rid of him, and then the Iraqis are going to get together and make a wonderful place. They have all the resources. It's Mesopotamia. They have the greatest resources in the world in agriculture, in so many areas. People don't know, but the first psychiatric hospital, we studied that in our courses, was in Baghdad. So they have a long history of a successful civilization. And I thought, okay, they'll get rid of Saddam Hussein, and then there's going to be a glorious period of prosperity in Iraq. Boy, was I wrong. And any other people in America who thought that's where it was going. the people get the leaders they deserved, and Saddam Hussein was the right leader for those people. And when the Americans took him out, then it became chaos. Then we got fights between all the different sects in Iraq. We got ISIS. It was a horror show. Way worse than under Saddam Hussein. The same in Libya. Everyone felt over. We'll get rid of Muammar Gaddafi. Then Libya is going to be a wonderful place. They've been in civil war ever since. We get the leaders we deserve. Now you can think about what that means for Canada, for the United States. Look at the leadership there. People are getting what they deserve. And this is a basic spiritual principle. It isn't all too bad, too sad, shouldn't be, arbitrary, it should be otherwise. No. Things have to be exactly as they are. That's the spiritual wisdom. And it's not only the Sufis who believe this. For those who have studied, and I did for a while, Advaita Vedanta, some of the great Advaita Vedantists, I was just re-looking at Robert Adams, talk exactly the same way. They say, everything is exactly the way it should be. Not a molecule is out of place in this universe. And I think my friend Hadi had this experience when he had a very high station that was shown to him where everything is exactly the way it should be. So decrying the reality, the Israelis shouldn't do this, and Hamas shouldn't do that, and Hezbollah shouldn't do this. No, everything is just the way it is, and it's perfect the way it is. Now there are a couple of other Sufis who have said things in a similar spirit. Okay, one is a well-known Maghribi and Moroccan Sufi named Moulay Adarkawi. And Moulay Adarkawi is famous in Sufi circles for his letters, Risala, to his murids. And at one point he says to one of them, he said, I have never seen a difficulty that one of my murids is going through that isn't directly connected to a defect in his nafs, in his ego. In other words, all the difficulties he's having come from his own self, from the flaws in his own self. And unfortunately, the same thing is true of nations. Every difficulty that every nation has is from their own defects, from their own selves. And if you don't believe me, which you probably don't at this point, I invite each of you, whenever there's a problem, go back and research the place where the problem is. Go back and look at what is happening in that place at that time where that catastrophe occurs. I remember doing this, starting to do it when the tsunami came. Remember that big tsunami? There were hundreds of thousands of people killed, not just 1,000 like in Israel and Gaza. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. What was happening in those places? Okay. And you'll find that the two worst places were the Tamil region of Sri Lanka and the Aceh region of Indonesia. What was going on in both places? A civil war. Allah doesn't like people fighting with each other. It's not true. Don't believe some of these extremists. Sometimes we have to fight, but Allah doesn't like, He prefers peace, doesn't like people fighting with each other. Civil war in both of those places, tsunami. There was a huge earthquake at one point. I studied it for the near-death experiences in Pakistan, near a place called Balakot. And when I looked it up, Al-Qaeda was organizing cells in that area, or Taliban, one of them, for terrorist activity. They were organizing cells. Nothing happens arbitrarily. When California gets wildfires, I'll let you figure that one out. But we got wildfires also in Quebec this year. It was so bad, I've never seen anything like it. The wildfires of Quebec, the smoke was going to New York City, where my brother lives. I never saw anything like that. Why could that be? Well, my humble opinion, this is related to a lot of the anti-religious, anti-Islamic laws being passed by the Quebec government, but they'll never see the connection. And now in France, one of the most anti-Islamic Western countries you can find, now they're having a huge bedbug infestation. We were studying in our Quran class recently the 10 plagues of Egypt. This is like the bedbug infestation in France is like one of those 10 plagues that the Pharaoh undertook. And France is also in a very anti-religious, especially anti-Islamic mood with this legislation and everything. All of these actions have consequences. That brings us back to another saying. I forgot to turn on the timer again. Brings us back to another saying of another great Moroccan Sufi, Ali Jamal. He said the following thing, and reflect on this. He said, everything to you is from you. I'll finish the phrase, but this is the most important part. Everything to you, everything happening to you is from you. And everything from you comes back to you. This is the sunnah, this is the habit of Allah. Okay, but everyone knows the second part. It's like karma. Everything you do comes back to you. But everything outside of that, everything that's happening to you is coming from you. From some of your actions, from some of your bad behavior, from some of your bad thoughts. Okay, everything to you is from you. True on an individual basis and true on a collective basis. So if something is happening to Palestinians, it comes from Palestinians. If something is happening to Jews, it comes from Jews. If something is happening to Iranians, it comes from Iranians. This is the sunnah of Allah. This is the way. There's only justice in this world. There's no injustice, no matter how it looks. So, whenever you see something going on around you, to you also, if it's happening to you, then start asking yourself, what did I do to bring this on? What am I doing wrong? How am I thinking wrong? What are my faults here? When it comes to you. When it comes to your nation, the same thing. The problem is that nations support each other. You know, so everyone, all the Israelis are saying, oh, this is horrible. How could this happen to us? It's not our fault. And all the Palestinians are saying, well, we're responding to this and, you know, all this terrible treatment from the Israelis. It's not our fault. And everyone in your community is supporting you in your ignorance. Because everything coming to you is from you. If you understand only that from this talk and try to figure it out, not always easy to know what it is, but there's something there that's causing your current suffering. You know, Muhammad Ali, who's very famous boxer, he understood this. I've heard reports, and my brother met him once. I think he's a wali, Muhammad Ali. He's a saint. And he said, I got this terrible Parkinsonism because I kept saying in the public domain, I am the greatest. But I am not the greatest. Allah is the greatest. He said, and this was the consequence. Now, all of us have to be careful. I have to be careful too. I'm thinking recently a lot about what I'm completely within Islam. I have no idea of regressing, if you want, back to Judaism, but I heard some very interesting things when I was with the Jewish community in Jerusalem. And one of the rabbis I met was a disciple of Reb Nachman of Bratislava. Was a great saint in the Judaic tradition. His name was Reb Gedalia Koenig. He was the first Jewish teacher who insisted that he have classes for women in Torah. Okay, so he was ahead of his time. And he said to me directly, I remember it like it was yesterday, he looked at me and he said, Yosef, which was my original Hebrew name, he said, Yosef, I see that you have the capacity for knowledge. But remember, in other words, he saw that I had a good capacity to understand things and perceive things and learn. He said, but remember well, no matter how much you understand, it's only a drop in the understanding, the ocean of understanding of Hashem, which is Allah in Hebrew. It was a very important moment. I remember it even now. Don't think, or as my mother would say, don't think you're so smart. There are smarter people around than you, but not only that, Allah is so much smarter than any of us, and He is in control. Every morning in Islam, when we wake up, there's a dua. Hasbi Allah wa la ilaha illallah. Tawakkaltu alayhi wa huwa rabbul arshil azim. Allah is sufficient. There's only one God. I'm trusting in Him, and He is the super manager. Rabb al-Arsh al-Adim. He is in control of the throne, the Arsh that controls the entire universe. So, as my mom would say, don't think you're a big shot. The big shot is up there. You're all little shots. No matter how smart, how rich, how strong, how fast you can run the 100 meters, you're all little shots. The big shot, the boss, is up there. He's in control, and he knows what he's doing. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun, salamun mursalin, walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Al-Fatiha. Thank you all for listening. Feel free to make comments or ask questions if you like about anything, any of the content of this talk.